Hey, everybody, and welcome to episode 1 of the Welcome to Midlife podcast. My name is Jessie Cates. I'm your menopausal bestie. I also happen to be a menopause coaching specialist and knee deep in my own menopausal era, coming to you to share resources, education, entertainment, and inspiration to help empower you to make this the best chapter of your life yet. Today's episode, we're talking all about heart palpitations. We're talking about this because this is actually one of the things that kicked off an awareness that something was wrong in my body. 2023, I dubbed the year I fell apart. It was a wild year of all sorts of crazy symptoms that continued to escalate as the year progressed, but it all got started with a scary episode of heart palpitations. This is something I haven't experienced too much in my life before. I've had moments where my heart has raced. I obviously know the experience of like an increased heart rate through the experience of exercise, but heart skipping a beat was a new one for me. There were moments where I started to feel like a little flutter at the start of 2023 that caught my attention. I was like, not quite sure what's going on there. That's a little wild. Then they started to get pretty intense. And it was an experience of like a rapid, faster beat of my heart. And then there would be this moment where I would feel it almost stop. It would like flutter and then pause and then thump back in my chest extremely hard. It was super weird. As I started to notice, gosh, I'm having this thing happening in my heart more and more, I then also started to notice that what always occurred with it was dizziness. I had a particularly scary episode driving in my car that made me go out for the first time and seek out help for something happening in my body. So I was driving, experiencing this like dizziness, and my vision got so blurred that I had to pull off the side of the road. It was in that moment that I was like, okay, I'm not messing around with this. In my 20s and my 30s, whenever anything weird would happen in my body, I'm pretty much under the school of thought that like, I'm just going to kind of ignore this and it's going to eventually go away. And pretty much through most of my 20s and 30s, that happened. I would feel something like, oh, that's weird in my whatever, and I'd ignore it and it would go away. In my 40s, the first time that this no longer applied. Now I started experiencing things in my body that were not going away, were not getting better, and in fact, were getting worse. So the heart palpitations was one of those things. And it was the first time ever in my adult body where I was like, I need to go see somebody about this thing happening in my body. So I went to my primary care, and my primary care referred me to a cardiologist. I then go to said, very expensive, by the way, cardiologist to get run through a battery of tests. They took me through everything. They sonogrammed my heart, and they saw in the sonogram those really weird moments where my heart would skip a beat. The sonogram tech, even when he saw it, was like, whoa, that's weird. Does that happen to you a lot? And I was like, yeah, like 10, 15 times a day. I got the treadmill test. I got the whatever it is where they spin you all around and they like slowly move the camera around and they take all these images of your heart. I spent hours and thousands of dollars in that office to be told, dun, 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 you're fine. There's nothing wrong with you. You're perfectly healthy. This particular cardiologist said to me, so the next time your symptoms come up, just ignore them. Gee, thanks, doc. That's the most amazing advice I've ever received. It was extremely frustrating and also set the tone of what would become a theme all throughout the rest of this year as I began to search out for help, looking for all these other crazy, changing symptoms that were showing up in my body this year and not getting any better or going away. So I left that cardiologist office in a weird place. I was like, I guess a little excited that he found nothing, but I was also upset that he found nothing because my heart kept fluttering. I kept having that experience. This went on for many, many months. Flash forward to almost an entire year later before I finally discovered that this and everything else I was going through was actually an experience of perimenopause. Something I never heard about before, as I'm sure many of you can relate to. And it set me down a deep dive to figure out what this thing was. And it was a very weird experience to have something going on in my body, my own body, that I was not prepared for, educated on, and honestly knew nothing about. Like, had no idea any of this was coming. Anyway, flash forward to now knowing that this is perimenopause, getting educated, and then going through an actual education process beyond just using YouTube and Instagram to learn about perimenopause. I actually went through an extensive menopause coaching program. So I learned deeply all there is to know about perimenopause, menopause, postmenopause, the symptoms, what they mean, why they happen, and what to do with them. So, heart palpitations. Since that was the first symptom that I personally experienced, that's the one we're going to kick off our podcast with by sharing what we can do to support ourselves with heart palpitations. So, diving in. Naturally, it makes complete sense that we're talking about taking care of the organ of our heart. Something that's super important to understand, you're going to hear me say this a million times. We have estrogen receptors everywhere in our entire body and mind. As we start to go through the changes of the transition of our menopausal era, we begin to have a really interesting experience of perimenopause first. And this is something that is a wild time where estrogen is not just necessarily declining like many people might think, but it's actually fluctuating. So I'm going to share a little something with you on my screen. Here you can see the hormone levels between the three kind of main stages: pre-menopause, perimenopause, and postmenopause. So if you look on the left of the screen, you will see what is called our reproductive years. Now, let's not get hung up on that word because not all women choose to reproduce, and the sole goal of a female is not to reproduce. So we will just take that language and choose not to subscribe to it if it is not relevant to our life journey. But we're looking at everything perimenopause, pre-menopause, and you can see a really even, really beautiful, steady supply of both our estrogen and our progesterone, two primary hormones flowing through our body. Then we enter the joyous experience of perimenopause, which for women can begin as early as 35. For most starts to kick off somewhere around 40 to 45, can last anywhere from 10 years and a little beyond. But during perimenopause, whenever you enter into it and however long you are experiencing it, if you look at the fluctuations on the screen, you'll see that it is a time where estrogen doesn't just steadily decline, it actually fluctuates like crazy. You'll have periods during this where it will dip super low. And during that, you might have experiences like a missed menstrual cycle. It will also surge back up really high, and you can have crazy responses that occur because of that. And then you're going to notice when we hit that postmenopausal stage all the way to the right of the image on your screen, that's when we get the decline. It dips down, and ultimately it eventually reduces and levels out and gets kind of all the way out of the system. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So you can see that is like, that's a wild time in our life hormonally. Because it's such a wild time hormonally inside our body and mind, it is creating external symptoms that are wildly fluctuating during this time. So because we don't have a steady, protective, inflammatory shield of estrogen, when we start to begin to see dips, peaks, and valleys in that protective hormone, we will then start to see dips and peaks and valleys in our physiological, in our neurological, in our emotional, in our everything experience of being in our body. So heart palpitations is a result of two things: external factors coming into the system and the state of the system on the internal. So one thing that we know that is an inevitable thing is we're in a state of wild fluctuation, meaning there is something happening on the inside that we can't change or control, right? It is what it is. This is the joy of being born with ovaries and having ovaries that are still working and feeling this change. So racing heart palpitations can absolutely be occurring because of the fluctuations that are occurring inside the hormonal balance, which affects the heart, the brain, the digestive system, the muscles, the bones. I mean, everything, you name it, not just the reproductive system, not just the ovaries and the uterus are being affected by the change. So the other thing to keep in mind is external factors. What are we bringing into our body? What are we bringing into the zone of chaos? And how the stuff we bring in can make a massive difference to our experience of these fluctuations in our hormones. So when we look at the heart, when we look at the things that affect the heart, when we look at what can increase or decrease, we are talking in an external category of things that tend to be labeled as stimulants. So when we look at what can I do specifically to help reduce my heart palpitations, maybe that's something that you're suffering with a lot. We can, number one, meet ourselves with grace because we cannot change the fluctuations of estrogen and progesterone in our body. So number one, we have to meet ourselves with grace, love, and tenderness. Number two, we can then look at what am I taking into my vessel while it's in this zone of chaos, and what stimulants might I be consuming that are exacerbating my heart and the palpitations and the beats. So stimulants, it's a top list of a lot of gals' favorites. Added sugar, caffeine, and alcohol. All the things that maybe for some of us during this stage of life with teenagers and aging parents and, body changes and stressful world and job stuff and relationship things, this is where many of us find our comfort. And not knowing that in a body where hormones are flowing smoothly, we might be fine with added sugar, caffeine, and alcohol. I love all three, had all three in a wonderful, healthy dose in my weekly life. But then I entered perimenopause, unbeknownst to me, still consuming alcohol, caffeine, and a lot of added sugar, and not realizing that those things were interrelated. So now we have to kind of meet our body as it is, get to know what's happening on the inside so we can better understand how what we're doing is influencing what's happening on the inside. So it is not a conversation of eliminate the stimulants. It is an investigative experience that I'm inviting you to go on. If heart palpitations is something that you're suffering from, then you want to look at what stimulants do I consume regularly and how much. So looking at and being honest with yourself about your caffeine, your sugar, and your alcohol intake. And maybe it starts simply as just leaning into one. I'm not saying go look at all three, because some of you might go, oh gosh, no, I will not give up my coffee. I will not give up my wine, a glass of wine at night. I will not give up my sugar, right? And I hear you, because I was the same with all three of those bad boys. I didn't want to let go of a single one. But I started to keep a food log. I started to just gently look at how much I was consuming and just making note of what increase or decrease to my symptoms I was noticing. And one of the biggest things that's tough to resolve is that what used to work doesn't work now, or how our body used to handle things, it doesn't handle them now. And you got to process that in your own sweet way and in your own sweet time. That's a part of the journey, is being able to like grapple with some stuff, maybe let go of some stuff, release some things that are, that aren't working for you all that well, so that you can continue to meet this body and mind as it is today. So maybe you personally hearing this can say, all right, I'm going to pick one of the three that's maybe the least threatening. So for me at the time, that was added sugar. Because man, I had such rituals around caffeine and around alcohol that I just was not ready to part with yet. Because keep in mind, I was still trying to actually accept that I was going through this thing that I was going through. So, you gotta move through it at your own gentle pace. So I was having lots of heart palpitations. And as I started to investigate, I was noticing that there were some correlations between some things. So one of the first things that I noticed was that the amount of added sugar that I was consuming was primarily coming from the alcoholic beverages that I was drinking, the creamer and stuff I was adding to my coffee. But I definitely had a healthy hand in trips to Dairy Queen with the family, grabbing a thing of candy, out of the Easter basket, eating the cookies that somebody baked me for Christmas time, all of those things. So what started to become really clear when keeping a log is that every day I was consuming caffeine and every day I was having an alcoholic beverage. So as much as I wanted it to be sugar, I saw, and it is sugar, that's a part of it. But like the thing that was becoming more obvious to me was the caffeine. So that's where I leaned in first, because of the list of three, or second, I should say, because of the list of three, the one I did not want to let go of at all was alcohol consumption. So caffeine is a big one, and it was a huge one for me. It might not be a big one for you. Everyone's body is going to tolerate stuff very differently. So you might be able to look at your caffeine consumption and make modifications. You don't have to necessarily eliminate to support your body during this transition. You might want to, or you might eventually choose to, but you have to make that decision from your own body's feedback, not from the advice that I give you or from the advice that someone else gives you. You have to take in the information, investigate it in your own self, and make your own informed decision for what's going to serve you best. So caffeine, you might notice, okay, I have 3 cups a day. And you might say, what happens if I just do 2? And then you might exist in that 2 cups a day for a bit and notice heart palpitations. Better, worse? Maybe it's better. And you might say, sweet, I just cut out 1 cup and I'm much better. Or maybe you notice, okay, I cut out 1 cup, it's still there. Let me try going down to, let me cut out another cup. Let me try 1 cup of caffeine a day. Notice your symptom changes, but stick with something enough to be able to really see what does the feedback that my body gives me. For me, caffeine, unfortunately, had to go completely. I tried slowly changing. I tried half caffeine, half decaf. I tried everything that I could, and I couldn't get anywhere other than to, for my own body, arrive at the decision that even a sip of caffeine was going to trigger heart palpitations. Womp womp. So I had to give up my beloved caffeine. But what's super cool about the experience is that there will sometimes be substitutions and or replacements for things, especially in our modern world now. So one of the things that I found that was a great substitute, because I did not want to give up my caffeine, but my heart needed me to, was I found something out there, and I'll put a link to it down below, called Dandy Blend. And this is dandelion. And it is literally, it tastes just like coffee. It gave me the taste that I loved of coffee without the caffeine, and actually some great properties for my brain and my body, which are actually supportive of the menopause experience. And it allowed me to maintain the ritual of like making a cup of coffee in the morning, which is something that I cherish immensely and then need my rituals and my routine. So, all will not be lost if you find you have to get rid of something. But you'll come to that decision at your own time. There is one other thing that I want to bring to your attention. But before I move on to that, just remember that the sugar is also things like, do you drink soda? Those kind of things can also be part of it as well. But the other thing to keep in mind that we do not ever associate with is that some of our menopausal symptoms are all intertwined with each other, and some symptoms can stand alone, and some actually become a result of other symptoms. In the case of heart palpitations, this is also something else to consider. If you are someone who is also experiencing the joys of night sweats, you are being dehydrated by that symptom while you sleep. So you can sometimes notice a correlation between, did you have a really active night sweat kind of night? Because then the next day you might have more heart palpitations because you are dehydrated. So another thing that we need to keep in mind is that hydration is an important part of making sure the heart stays relatively supported as it's going through the fluctuations of our estrogen. So as you pay attention to things, also pay attention to hydration levels, pay attention to night sweats and any relation that is in there, and just see if you notice some common themes, see if you come to any conclusions about your heart palpitations and about the symptoms of your menopausal journey. And as always, I'm right there with you. Welcome to Midlife.